Order, and welcome to the Scottish Affairs Committee and our first evidence session on Scotland's space sector. And we're all really excited to be undertaking this. We've been looking forward to this for quite a while, and I think the issue came up quite regularly in our previous inquiry into defence in the High North. So we're delighted to have two star-studded panels who are going to help us out with a lot of the background to Scotland's space sector's relationship with the rest of the UK and Europe, and some of the strengths and weaknesses and some of the issues that we should be looking at. So without any further ado, I'll let our first two guests introduce themselves. We'll start with you, Mr. Liddle.
Thank you very much. My name's Doug Liddle. I'm the CEO of InSpace Missions, but the capacity I'm here today in is as the Vice Chair of UK Space, the trade body.
Mr. Staniland.
Thank you very much. I'm Andrew Staniland. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Thales Linear Space in the UK, and today I'm here in my capacity as the VP of Space for the trade body ADS.
So, well, thank you both, gentlemen. And I don't know why we're surprised at this, but we've had so many submissions from people who are interested in the sector, and it's a wide range of different contributions that we've had, which has informed the committees of the strengths and the strategies, how we go forward. And I'm just wondering if there's the first question, in this inquiry is, do you think that the UK and Scottish Government space strategies have the right priorities for the Scottish space sector? We'll start with you, Mr. Liddle.
I think when you look at the priorities of the UK's national space sector and national space strategy, what you see is something which is focused much more around the applications, the technologies. So we have, it's focused in a number of different areas, whether it be Earth observation, telecoms, etc. There is a regional element to it, and that's a lot around the clusters, etc., and helping to support the growth of clusters. And obviously, there's an element to it which is to do with launch, which is another thing which is key in Scotland. But in terms of is there an alignment with Scotland and the Scottish space strategy? Not massively, but then I don't think there is an alignment with the Cornish space strategy or the North West space strategy. There is a kind of a policy-led strategy for the UK, of which, in the Scottish space strategy we see
Have we a UK space strategy then? And
yes.
Is that the right one?
Yes, so we have a UK space strategy which talks to what we as a country should be doing and how we should be, our place in the universe, our place in the world, and how we...
In your words, maybe could you tell us exactly what your understanding of what the UK is trying to achieve with the strategy just now then?
So it's trying to achieve a number of things, among them economic growth in the UK. It's trying to look at elements like soft power. It's looking at exports. There's an element there which is around regional growth and being a science and technology powerhouse as well. So there are a number of different elements inside that, as well as the skills piece which comes along with it. So it's quite a broad, wide-ranging strategy, whereas the Scottish one is much more around economic growth, and I think that partly that's because space being a reserved matter. It means that it's very difficult to talk about the policy elements of space when you're having a Scottish space strategy.
And I know we've got Scottish colleagues coming after you guys have given your evidence. We'll ask them more just a little bit about how that works in terms of being almost an exclusive reserved responsibility in Scotland's strategy when it comes to that. But I just wondered with you, Mr. Stanley, what we've seen about the strengths of, if we could call it the Scottish sector, like the small satellite manufacturing we've heard already from Mr. Liddle about launch capability in space sports. Is that where we should be focusing on in this inquiry, is looking at the strengths of what Scotland is? Is that roughly the areas that you believe that Scotland has got a specific area to offer?
I think the Scottish space sector is quite reflective of the rest of the UK space sector in some part. It's dominated by SMEs, and it's dominated by companies that have started off with a vision and then a mission and started to implement that vision for themselves, sometimes with some VC funding, sometimes with some government funding, but largely growing as far as they can to where they are today. And I think, yes, you absolutely should focus on exploitation of those strengths, but clearly there's some endemic weaknesses in having a predomination of SMEs within the country. And it's the same across the whole of the UK, and you can see it in the National Space Strategy and the other regional space strategies that have been published. It's now a question of how do you scale up those SMEs to exploit what they've done so far and their position within both the regional marketplace and then their place in the globe as a whole.
I mean, I think, like, in submissions we've had thus far, it's the scaling up issue that seems to be the predominant one, and I think a lot of those involved and interested in the sector are identifying that as a place that we should look at, like, just more keenly. Is there any view that we could resolve some of this? What do we do to get around this need to scale? I mean, I understand to scale it quickly. It's this fast-changing technology, and I'm sure there's a number of innovations that are coming in almost a weekly or monthly basis. What do we do to keep pace with, like all the different things we need to look at?
I think in terms of what you could do, I think there's a few areas where the space strategy, the national space strategy, was intended to look at a very broad, very ambitious view of everybody within the UK, and to try and capture all those areas where we already have a strength. Maybe not a number one in the world strength, but certainly a regional strength, something that could be developed. And really, the challenges of our sector as a whole within the UK, and Scotland is no different, it's in terms of infrastructure and how do you get your footprint to be bigger and wider and be able to exploit the technology you've got. It's moving through what we call technology readiness levels from typical R&D all the way through up to things that can go into space and be ready to deliver a service. And then it's how do you get sufficient skills, both in quantity and quality, in order to do that exploitation. It's relatively straightforward in the UK to get enough support to turn an idea into a 4, 5, 10, 20 person company. Once you get beyond 50, then you're into, well, where do I get my skills from? So I think we see in every part, our members are always talking about this, we see a need for more skills in more depth and more breadth. We see a need for bigger infrastructure, support for that infrastructure, and we see a need to get through the R&D phase into that mission procurement phase to explore those technologies.
We want to specifically come to skills because I know that's really important. Again, a number of the submissions that we've had have referenced this and said there's a bit of a challenge and an issue to get the necessary personnel, and so we'll come to that. But I'm just curious about the strategies. Do you believe, Mrs. Tanaland, that the Scottish space sector is properly taken into account when the UK is determining its own space strategy?
Yes, I believe that the overall UK space strategy is a national space strategy. It takes into account both civil and defence viewpoints. So it has at its heart a synergistic view of the sector as a whole. It wants to exploit budgets across both the defence and the civil sector, which is the first time we've ever had that as a mission, a goal from the country. And it's intended to make sure that we learn from both sectors. The civil sector is predominantly characterised by single-year settlements within the spending review. That's changing slowly. Defence, much more longer term. So there are areas where that can be taken into account. In terms of the regional aspect, as Mr. Little said previously, I think there are elements within the National Space Strategy that talk about the regionalistic nature of our future and a need to move funding and capability away from its traditional base in the southeast. There's been movement within the activities since the publication of the strategy to do some of that funding, but we don't believe, or our members don't believe, it's gone far enough yet. There are movements in that direction, but not yet.
Are your members reasonably satisfied with what they see as the UK space strategy? Is it something that they feel is the right direction and this is what we need to be doing to develop this?
Yeah, broadly, yes. I think there's always a need to do more, to go faster, to want more. We both represent industry, and industry is always wanting more. But I think in general terms, it's a strategy that reflects where the country is and where it wants to go. And there's been a lot of work being done since the publication 2 years ago and still ongoing into how we turn those strategies into action and into concrete plans that can be implemented in the future.
And I'm presuming, Mr. Little, that you're invited regularly to roundtables with government and all those decision makers, those that are compiling the strategy.
There's certainly a level of engagement for the trade body with government. Often, obviously, some things are done more autonomously than others, but industry does tend to be consulted, and we're fairly satisfied, as Mr. Sutherland says, with the outcomes. Reflecting on the fact that the National Space Strategy sort of talks to a 10-year programme, and they would argue they're at the end of sort of, I think they've broken them into phases which are sort of reminiscent of launching a rocket. So I think we're in the ignite phase at the moment. We're about to go into, I forget what the next phase is called. I think I've written no.
Takeoff.
Takeoff. Thank you. But
You guys know this stuff,
you'd think I would remember what was after ignite, but yes. So as a consequence, it's moving a bit slower than we would like, but the direction of travel of what they're trying to do is right, and industry is behind that. I would say, sort of referring back to Scotland again, it's interesting that, you look from our members' point of view, and actually in Scotland we have a sector which actually is a fully joined up value chain. Once we actually have launch going out of Scotland, we've got everything from
That's specifically on your membership. I mean, what proportion of your membership are Scottish businesses?
Portion of UK space membership. I would need to
just roughly. I mean, you can come back with detailed numbers if you have that bit.
It's about 10 to 15% of the UK space companies are based in Scotland.
My estimate was going to be 10%, so it's somewhere around there.
Oh, well, it's above our population share, so that seems to be. And do you make sure that these voices are properly listened to, and there is good representation from the Scottish space sector?
Absolutely, and much like, as I say, the agency will look across the number of different areas, such as Earth observation, telecoms, etc. We organise the trade body in a similar way. So actually, we have a launch committee, and that launch committee has you would probably argue, a disproportionate percentage of Scottish interest and membership and drive in terms of where that's, the policy and the other things that we would then take to government and say, this is what we want to do. But you might find less in other areas.
Just lastly from me, we are going to Glasgow, and I think it's some of your members that we're actually going to be meeting when we and they're all looking forward to it. It's part of our getting to know this sector just that little bit better. Is there anything that we should be asking them or looking at when we're going there?
I would say, to my mind, it would be good to understand how this. So, as an example, a lot of the manufacturing of satellites done in Glasgow, and it's often talked to that there are, more satellites built in Glasgow than any other European city. It would be good to understand how that will join up with our launch aspirations, because a lot of those satellites are quite small. And I think there's a story which is a broader one where the UK needs to come together, and there are people south of the border that are building larger satellites that would actually make use of those rockets. And it's interesting to just see how it's joining up, I think. So it's worth a discussion with our colleagues in Glasgow and elsewhere.
Definitely take that advice. Is you any advice to offer us, Mr. Staniland, about sort of things that we should be asking and looking at?
I think one of the things that we see from our members, we are a space sector, but actually space is an environment, not a sector. That sector covers many, many markets, and the different companies within Scotland, although they are exploiting the use of space in some way, they have different aspirations. And when you talk to us as the trade body, we are representing the sort of average view of all those different companies. And I think the companies in Scotland that you'll see have different individual needs. Some of them are quite large, considering compared to the rest of the UK population of companies, and will be at a different place in their life cycle compared to some of the other companies. I think, and therefore they'll have some different specific challenges. So I think my personal view would be the same as Mr. Liddell's. It's how do you connect the different parts of the supply chain together, or the ecosystem together, so that they are using a UK national launch capability. How do you make sure that becomes a crown jewel within Europe, so that we can start catching up with our European colleagues and competitors? And some of the companies will be really focused on the skills, which we'll touch on later on. So I would be very open-minded to the different needs of those different companies.
We're very much looking forward to it, so thank you for that. Christine Charlton.
Thank you very much. Some of the evidence we have suggests, written evidence suggests, that there's a specific challenge for Scottish companies looking to access funding to scale up. You referred to this a few minutes ago, actually, and I'd like to explore that a wee bit more. It seems to me from the written evidence that there is funding there for startup, but it is the scaling up. So is this a concern that you are recognising from your Scottish members and that you're hearing about from your Scottish members?
Absolutely. I mean, this is a national issue, though, so this isn't unique to Scotland. We have an issue in the UK that we're very good at getting companies through that first phase, getting up to the first million in revenues, the first 5-10 people in the organisation, and then it's very hard to get them up to the next step. I had the same issue myself when I was growing a company, and we hear it from a lot of our members in the UK space that actually finding ways to do that without having to immediately dilute ownership of the company and go and get VC funding, which in itself isn't always the right solution at that point. When a company needs space to breathe and grow, is always a challenge. So we see it, we see it in Scotland, and mainly we see it in Scotland because, as I think Mr. Thunland said, Scotland is a collection of SMEs. The UK as a whole is dominated by a prime, and it has a lot of supply chain around that prime. Scotland in particular is a collection of SMEs who are all very capable, but they're all, you can almost see the Scottish space sector as an SME that's got to a certain size and is bursting to make that next leap. And there's that feeling at the moment that we need to find a way to bring cash into the story that would allow these businesses to make the next step. And whether that be by government getting involved and procuring services or products from them, or whether it's government-backed loans, or a number of different ways. And then you solve one problem and the next problem arrives, which is, as a small company, where do you get the people from? And there are scarce skills, and that's felt across the whole UK again, but more keenly in Scotland, we notice.
Alan, did you want to?
Yeah, I think it's also worth pointing out that the funding for infrastructure and part of probably the main issue with scaling up is an infrastructure problem. How do you get bigger as a company, and how do you get bigger facilities? Within the UK, it's quite fragmented, and some of the entities within the UK who have benefited in recent years from significant investment, government investment, to scale up their facilities, it's been not just regional but very local funding sources. So, the National Space Test Facility in Harwell was funded by UKRI. The infrastructure in Leicester and Westcott were funded by local enterprise partnerships, or by UKRI Research England, which is only a fund that you can use in England. So I think there are some areas within England that have very local funding solutions, and there are entities who have been able to exploit those, and they're not available to Scottish companies. So I think whether that means you need to investigate more localised funding solutions in Scotland, or whether you need to make sure that whole of government approach across the whole kingdom is implemented, or a mixture of the two, I think that's worth paying attention to as well.
That was going to be my next question. How can the government help to fill that gap, or does it need to come from private enterprise, or should it be the government that steps in more?
Probably a little bit of both, and the government is stepping in on some of these issues. They've recently just closed the Space Clusters Infrastructure Fund. The announcements of who was successful in those applications will be done in the next month or so, and the majority of that funding was intended to be outside the southeast, a mixture of industry and academia, but it was part of the Levelling Up Fund within the Space Agency, so it was intended to push funds further away. We'll wait and see which companies and which entities were successful in that. So they are making, at a government level, they are making strides into doing that change, but at the moment it's quite small to see whether it makes a difference, and then the plan would be that funding improves, increases, and has a longer lifetime.
In your joint submission, you suggested that the UK government should maybe use contracts rather than grants to encourage growth in the space sector. What would be the benefit of that approach, do you think?
I think the benefit would be that UK government would actually get something valuable in return. So, at the moment, I'm not, growing a company for a grant is obviously a valuable thing, but at the end of it, there's nothing tangible. And actually buying services, buying some of the data that the satellites will generate, buying national capabilities for defence, whatever you're talking about, what you end up with is a win-win, because the company in most cases, the company is prepared to suck up some of the NRE and the non-recurring stuff in order to deliver the service to the government. The government gets a service at the end of it, or a product, and then the company then has an ability to go out and export that with the rubber stamp that UK government buys this, so I can take this around the world now. So it's a fantastic way to grow capability in the UK and to create a really strong export story.
Mr. Stanley, did you want to add anything to that?
I think there's another aspect to moving towards procurement of capability rather than just grants. I think the levelling up within government and government agencies would be a fact that would be improved if we moved as a nation towards more missions and more programs. I think at the moment we are a country that is good at doing R&D, that has excellent technology, some amazing scientists and engineers within the country, and focus very heavily on that early technology aspect. But that also means that the government is very good at doing that kind of work. And once you start moving towards doing missions and capabilities, you level up the government, the agencies, the government departments that are responsible for those budgets, and you end up with a more intelligent customer able to do more things. And rather than, this is a stretch in terms of how it would go, but rather than writing a strategy, then thinking about how the plan comes along, you would be writing a strategy with an implementable plan at the same time. And suddenly all the timelines get concentrated into a much shorter period of time. So I think that's one benefit you would get. I think the other thing is, if you move up the value chain from a technology grant to a mission, you start to bring the supply chain along with you. One of the things that our members complain about, no matter who the customer is, it's a huge burden in responding to requests for proposals and filling out the administrative side of those RFPs and those requests for funding. And by taking the requirement up a level, then the supply chain doesn't have to have that burden of responding to many proposals, which is becoming quite high, particularly as the companies that are in that medium phase, the SME M bit, you're big enough to do the work, but not quite big enough to win the work, if that makes sense. And I think having more missions at a high level, you're putting that burden of response on the larger companies, and then they can bring the small companies along.
One last thing, smaller thing. Mr. Liddell mentioned data and data procurement. Are there specific kinds of space services that the UK and Scottish governments could procure in Scotland that would be helpful?
I think there's a lot of stuff around Earth observation data, so actually imagery, where you can, there are a number of different services that will be coming online, I think, over the next 5-10 years, everything from understanding what's going on with, carbon and greenhouse gas emissions, to understanding what's happening with forestry, coastal erosion, monitoring algal blooms, all the kind of things that you can do very, very simply and quickly from space, that would normally involve actually people going out into the field with cameras and sticks and putting them in the water or whatever. It becomes a much simpler job to do that with a satellite. With the advantage being, of course, if you can do it in Scotland, you can then do it in Singapore, because actually the satellite's just going around everywhere eventually. So it becomes then exportable services. But yes, so Scotland certainly could make more use of space data. We're aware that, organisations like the Satellite Applications Catapult has looked at a number of things that could be done with space data, whether that be monitoring illegal fishing or even town planning, which actually can be done just with the sort of simplicity of taking images from space. Because typically you might go onto Google Maps and you would look at a picture, but it's months or sometimes years old. And actually what you really like is to have a regular image over the same area to understand, as an example of the planning example, if somebody's suddenly built a massive shed on their farm, and you can say, actually, that wasn't there in January, but that is there on the 15th of March. Hang on a minute, they didn't have planning permission until, and it becomes a really, interesting way to manage everything from very local things to very global things. So yes, and by having access to some of this data, there's then the contribution in general to, we are looking, we're rejoining Copernicus at the moment as a country. But you can point to that the reason Copernicus is actually trying to understand the planet and what's happening with climate change. Well, actually, we can also be creating those missions in the UK they can be nationally funded things, they can be contributing missions, and we can be bringing value using what we've got in the UK, which is everywhere from academia, so the really low technology readiness level stuff, the real blue sky thinking, all the way up to the implementation side. And actually we have that in the UK, and we particularly, you could say in a very concentrated form, we have that in Scotland. So there's a lot of capability there that we could be exploiting.
Thank you.
Thank you. Wendy Chamberlain.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair. It was just, Mr Sutherland, just thinking about some of your comments to Christine Jardine there. Is there sufficient knowledge in government, in the civil service, and dare I say it within Parliament of the sector to allow us and enable us to ask the right questions and make the right offerings?
Unfortunately, I'm going to have to suspend proceedings. We have fallen below our quota. Hopefully that will be resolved and we'll be back as soon as we possibly can. Order. Order, order, and welcome back to the Scottish Affairs Committee. We are now quorum with the addition of Mr David Duckett, and so we're ready to go into our second session on Scotland's space sector, and we have representatives of the Scottish space sector who I will now allow to introduce themselves, and we'll start with you, Dr Khan.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the ability to come and talk here. My name is Dr Hina Khan. I'm the Executive Director for Space Scotland.
Excellent, and thank you, Professor Woodhouse.
Hi, so I'm Ian Woodhouse. I'm a Professor of Applied Earth Observation at the University of Edinburgh. I also chair the Scottish Space Academics Forum, and for full disclosure, I'm also a co-founder and part-time employee of Earthblock, so SME based out of Edinburgh.
All right, well, you seem like the perfect couple to come and help us out with all the issues about Scotland's space sector. So we'll get down, given this is one of our introductory sessions. What are the distinctive strengths and weaknesses of the Scottish space sector? And we'll start with you, Dr Khan.
I think there's a lot to be proud of within the Scottish space sector. So just as a bit of an introduction to Space Scotland itself. So Space Scotland is a not-for-profit organisation there to really support and add value to the Scottish space industry. So it's a community-run, industry-led forum where the community comes together. And then Space Scotland as an entity tries to support that, but also engages across UK and Scottish Government colleagues to drive the growth of the sector alongside our academic forum partners as well. And so as an organisation, we listen to our, it's not so much a membership, there's no trade body here, it is a community group, but we have partners from the industry forum who we listen to and try and articulate their challenges, and then in fora like this, we're able to provide a representation of that. And so when you think about the Scottish space sector over the last kind of 15 to 20 years or so, which has really been kind of the journey that we've been on from the kind of world-leading excellence within the academic forum, and then the development of kind of small industries and individuals, entrepreneurs who came and started to think about how do we develop capability from a base of an educational framework, and that's mainly been on the engineering manufacturing side, but also on data applications. And really it was the development in the kind of nascent small satellites. So as you miniaturise technology in our mobile phones, and as general technology became much smaller and accessible, we were able to, individuals realise that there was an ability to take that and put it into a form factor which could then be used to monitor our global environment. And so there was a number of things that happened quite surreptitiously, you could say advantageously, which coupled together the technology expertise within the academic forum, the development of these new capabilities within small miniaturisation, and then being able to put that onto a form factor which could then be launched and provide excellence and value from space. And so that's kind of what happened over the last kind of decade or so.
It's really interesting, and thank you for explaining and defining your organisation. It's really helpful just to hear exactly what you do and what we've received, and we're quite surprised and we've knocked out with the number of submissions we've had in this. It's really encouraging that there seems to be a great interest in Scotland's space sector, and a lot of people have got many things to say about it, but the strengths that seems to be coming back in our submissions is, as you mentioned, Dr Khan, the small satellites, our launch capability, and I think there's quite a number of representations and all that, and the strength of our SME sector. Is that roughly the strengths we should be looking at, Professor Woodhouse, when we go through this inquiry? We're hopefully going to be meeting some of your colleagues next week who can maybe help us a bit more about what they're specifically doing. But are those areas of strength, small satellites, launch capability, strength of SMEs?
It's once we have the capability of launch, it's the fact that we have the end-to-end process, so that there are companies, university research centres, lots of activity across all of the different components from the end-to-end. So designing, building, launching, well, soon to launch, and then analysing the data when it's brought back to Earth. So it's the fact that we will at some point have that.
How important is it to get that? Because there's been lots of conversations for a good number of years now about getting that launch facility. I know we're pretty close to it, but how important is it to the Scottish space sector?
I think it's important. I guess we'll get onto the weaknesses in a minute. But the potential strength is that it's a much better story to tell. So you can attend on any international platform, and you can very clearly tell a clear, unique, identifiable story about Scotland, and help to put the Scottish space sector on the map. Without that end-to-end process, then arguably, yes, it's quite difficult to go to an international forum and really make a case why Scotland is different from a whole number of small and large companies that are now potentially catching up.
It is like we're starting to get into the weaknesses now, and I would suspect that you would agree with that. That's something that we very much quickly require in Scotland. Is that
I think it is about that. How do we make sure that the story that we're telling, but also the reality of the situation that we have in Scotland in terms of the sector, that we are a differentiator across what else. There are a number of space nations, you could say, globally, but what differentiates Scotland from any other number, small and large, that would allow either companies to come and invest in Scotland or see it as a position for them to want to build their space capability, but also how do we make sure that Scotland has a position within that global space environment. And that discussion around end-to-end that Professor Woodhouse has just mentioned, that's very much quite a unique kind of selling point that we have. And with that missing puzzle piece of the launch being, hopefully over the next few months, realised in a successful way, then that gives us that whole discussion piece where you can now build and test capability, launch, and then get that data down to deliver the services and the applications which we all need and use and will provide the world in a better state.
And we do, and we've discussed it obviously, and I think you heard most of the session with UK-wide colleagues. We've got a UK space strategy, as you would expect, a nation of the UK size, but we've got a Scottish strategy too, and how do they work together? Obviously most of the issues are reserved, as we've heard, and there'll be real ministerial responsibility down here in Whitehall and UK government. How does a Scottish space strategy fit in with a general UK strategy, and does it work together seamlessly, or does it create any difficulties and problems for you?
I think the idea behind the Scottish space strategy was really to champion and understand where the value assets were within Scotland. What is it that Scotland can really shout about, and where are the challenges where interventions from a Scottish government perspective, as you mentioned, not necessarily dealing with the policy side of things, but what interventions can Scottish government make and the industry and academia forum as a whole put in place that will allow the Scottish space sector to grow. The Scottish space environment is quite different from the rest of the landscape across the UK, partly because of its size and geography, but also in the makeup of the industry segment, as we heard in the previous session. It is much more, of the SME, the small medium-sized enterprises. There are no primes, as you would imagine. They are, from what a prime industry look like. There are no primes in Scotland per se. There are larger companies that have a footprint in Scotland, but the majority of the companies are the kind of sub 100, 200 personnel. And so because of that, there are various, and we'll talk about the challenges in a second, various challenges, but that also means that there can be support mechanisms that, as Space Scotland, I can work with government and our academic colleagues to say, how do we partner together to make the best use of that? There's also some key interesting elements that Scottish Government has kind of decided that they want to take a lead on, obviously a just transition, looking at net zero, looking at how sustainability can be embedded across a variety of its key sectors. Space has been identified within the kind of National Economic Transformation Strategy, which was launched from Scottish Government last year. Space has been identified as a key priority. So how do we ensure that the elements of Scottish Government policy as a whole are also implemented within our space strategy? So there were key things that we wanted to focus on, which are kind of distinct from what the UK is trying to do, but absolutely trying to align with them as well. So we're not looking to do things differently. We're just looking to do things that are slightly more attuned to the Scottish environment.
I think I've got that. So just really making sure that we play to our strengths
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
supporting the sector that we have in Scotland, and we get that, and I think that sort of makes sense. And it seems like you're able to fit in with what the UK strategy seems to be trying to work towards. And is that your experience of what's happening, Professor Woodhouse? And what do you make of the Scottish space strategy? Are we actually starting to meet its intentions and goals? And I mean, what's your observations of what we're doing?
My observation, there's two things I think I'd make an observation of. One is that everybody should have a space strategy. Okay, the fact that there's a Scottish space strategy and a UK space strategy should actually make us wonder why every government body in the UK not got a clear strategy of how they're going to actually incorporate the huge growth in space data in particular, and how that's going to be used and what they're going to do with it. So it makes perfect sense that that different parts of the UK would have a space strategy. Perhaps a little bit more of a critical slant is that I would say that neither strategy is so specific that that you could say, well, one strategy says we'll do this, and another one strategy says no, we won't do that, we'll do something else. I don't think either strategy actually, or the documents, and they're quite old now, so we've moved on a little bit since then.
We need sort of more milestones and measurable targets.
Yeah, very specific things. I mean, if the UK Space Agency's North Star metric is total investment into the UK, I mean, who's going to argue with that? It's not something that you would develop a strategy say no, our strategy is to avoid any more investment into the UK. So it's very easy to align if your strategy documents are relatively general and are making sort of quite broad statements. I think we now have to, and that was appropriate for the time. I think we now have to start to get a bit more specific and have a little bit more clarity of exactly where they.
Have we got enough detailed data on the scale of the space sector in Scotland? Do we know what we're doing? If you could help me with that, Dr.
So, I mean, there's been UK-wide studies. The UK Space Agency, with partnership with No Space or London Economics, launched the Size and Health Report, which was issued last year, I think. Now, that gives a whole perspective across the whole of the UK. Trying to delineate out the Scottish element in that is sometimes quite challenging, but Scottish Government, or Scottish Enterprise I should say, did a kind of dissection of the previous Size and Health Report, which gave some of the statistics. Now those numbers are quite old, they're back from 2017, 2018, so we're 5 years on from that, but that's still showing a growth of the sector and a higher proportion of jobs in Scotland relative to what would be appropriate, you could see appropriate to the size of the nation and the general population. So there's still a significantly higher number of high-value jobs in the space sector in Scotland, and also the growth of the SME, the industry, which is happening. But perhaps what we need to think about is how are the interventions being put in place that will allow that to really flourish, and I think we'll talk
just
about
on that before I hand over to Mr. Duca. Like a lot of the submissions we've had, and as I said, they've been genuinely positive and encouraging. It sort of talks about Scotland's potential, and what we're hearing is that we have got the potential to be a leader when it comes to the space sector and developing space facilities and resources. Is that your view, and is there anything that we need to specifically do in order to meet that ambition and realise ourselves as a major player? I mean, not of a NASA scale, obviously, but for a small nation with our geography, is this a good opportunity for us?
I think it's a good opportunity, but I think there absolutely is things that need to be done in order to realise that. I don't think it's going to happen just by us standing by and watching. I think that's not going to happen. And I also don't think it's going to happen just by leaving it to industry to say, right, off you go and go and find your own way. And when you're ready, then let us know and we'll give you a high five. It's not necessarily that. I think there have to be significant and substantial interventions, either from a national, i.e. UK level, but also from a Scottish perspective. There are clear potentials in terms of what we can do. Launch, you've also mentioned the way the data is used, how the data is managed, procured. How do we use the information that we're getting in a practical way, which then demonstrates that the government, the country within which a company resides is actually seeing the value of the assets that they're delivering from. And so if we can start to make that story much more compelling, then yes, we start to get into a position of seeing that the potential can move forward. But I think there's still a lot to be done to get to that point, I think.
Have we got the potential, Professor Woodhouse?
We've got the potential. I see the biggest risk is the complacency of us thinking that our potential is sufficient and not taking that forward. And the other thing is potentially not playing to our strengths in a broader sense, is that we can get very focused when we talk about space. But our skills, the National Robotarium, for example, is on the Heriot Watt campus, and that's the UK's National Robotarium and AI Centre. The term AI only appears once in the entire UK strategy and not at all in the Scottish strategy. And so we need to look broader. So outside those little, the focus on launch and small satellites and everything else, to consider that, well, there's other strengths that Scotland has that we need to make sure that it's joined up with what we're doing in space. And I know, in fact, Dr. Khan and Space Scotland are making some effort, and in terms of linking up with FinTech Scotland, linking up with Robotarium. In Edinburgh, at the EPCC, for example, just got the DSIT go-ahead for the exascale computing. We're not doing a very good job of linking that up with the space strategy in terms of what we're a powerhouse for supercomputing. And that's, we heard in the earlier session about just how much data we've got to try to analyse. We need to make better links between those as well.
Excellent, thank you for that. David Duckett.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you for coming along today to speak to us. Professor Woodhouse, you were saying earlier how important it is to have the end-to-end industry covered in Scotland. And I think with the evidence we've received so far, the written submissions we've received so far, there's clearly a fairly decent history now of where businesses in Scotland have excelled worldwide in terms of small satellites, for example, and other aspects. And we're getting into the other aspects of the space launch, or the space launch is one of them, one of the aspects, but the whole end-to-end process of space activity, as I think you were describing it. But I just wonder how, you've already described how important it is, or what the value would be in having everything we need essentially in Scotland. But is there a risk, or let me ask you that a different way, how should we go about addressing any risk of holding ourselves back until we've got everything we need in Scotland? Obviously we can work as part of the UK, we can work with the European Space Agency, we can work with other space agencies to at least make sure we're progressing along with the industries we already have. Is there anything you'd suggest we need to think about in terms of how we would avoid holding ourselves back until we have everything?
I guess that just I would just add to what I was just saying in terms of the linking up the areas of expertise that we already have in Scotland, who are not necessarily engaged with space. So the Robotarium, as far as I know, has never put in an application to a robotics call-in from the European Space Agency. So in terms of geo-return and everything, it's like, well, but there is a lot of money that we are contributing to that includes a robotics program in the European Space Agency. It's not all just about small satellites and launch and data. And so we have to make sure that we engage with them. Scotland would be a hotbed of activity in the space sector even if we didn't have the end-to-end. I think I would argue that the real value in the end-to-end is that it makes a much better story to tell that makes us unique, is that having something to say that nobody else can say gives an advantage to all of the companies across that whole chain. But even without that, we're still world class in lots of sectors in the space industry. So I don't think there's any sense in holding back. Nobody's twiddling their thumbs waiting for launch to happen. I think they're all running as fast as they can to get to make their businesses work anyway. And the universities are still collaborating internationally. We're still looking at R&D projects. The university is not particularly reliant on having Scottish launch in order to make a big difference.
Thank you. Dr. Khan, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would just echo that actually. I think it is from where I sit within Space Scotland and looking at the industry segment, the more and more I see it's linking in with those sectors which perhaps don't really consider themselves part or have any value in the space sector, but actually the applications and how you can use and manoeuvre the data in a way which actually does make it useful. So working with the Innovation Network across Scotland, which is quite an expansive and cross-sectoral forum from the the data lab to, you know, Scottish aquaculture, to the built environment, you know, the smarter transformation for the built environment, essentially construction innovation centre, you know. So how do we link into to those sectors to see the value that space can add into that, and then for them to then go and become more engaged with some of the funding or some of the opportunities that are available to them. So part of my role within Space Scotland is to provide that kind of uplift of knowledge across sectors, so working with financial services companies, you know, the big four essentially within financial services, because they have a need to understand how data is used and managed in a way which helps their clients. So by having those conversations, we uplift all of the sector, and then we have those additionalities, which is where I think we're going to get the value and start to kind of addresses a number of different things, you know, from skills as well as you know, a workforce which is more informed about how space can be used in a variety of ways.
And given that space policy is reserved to the UK government or UK Parliament, is there anything you think that we as a committee should be looking at in terms of recommending to the UK government that would represent a gap in that? Is there certain activities happening in Scotland that may not be happening elsewhere in the UK that we need to maybe drive that focus towards?
Well, I think there's definitely activity happening in Scotland, which is at the forefront of activity that's happening elsewhere across the UK. I mentioned just a moment ago the kind of idea of in the development in space sustainability. How do we use space data, but also applications to make our world more sustainable, our space domain more sustainable, and applications that can be in the sector more sustainable. Now, I know the UK Space Agency are beginning to start to really look at that in earnest, and there's been a lot of work over the last kind of 12 months or so at a national UK level on that front, and that's really fantastic to see. In Scotland, we've been looking at that for quite some time previously, and so we want to be able to share the value that the knowledge that we've gained and the value that we've had in engaging with the sector community. And again, it comes back to, you know, because the sector in Scotland is an SME sector, we're able to have conversations with them at a different level because they're smaller companies, slightly more agile, slightly able to implement changes to their supply chain, their processes, which perhaps are a little bit more challenging for some of the more established organisations across the rest of the UK. And so we can test various different capabilities and looking at carbon audits, looking at credits, looking at how you become more of a sustainable manufacturer, and working with national organisations like the National Manufacturing Institute in Scotland, NMIS, who really have a mandate to really think about sustainable manufacturing. And so we can take our SME community within the sector along this journey and then demonstrate that actually this is how you can manoeuvre a sector to become more sustainable. We talked about launch, you know, looking at sustainable launch, looking at responsive launch, and starting to think about those elements. And so by doing them in Scotland, we can then, it's almost like a little kind of test bed ecosystem that you can develop capability in, and then be able to say that, you know, actually across the UK, you can start to roll this out both in UK and across Europe. So I would, you know, if there's something I would ask you to do, then maybe it's to encourage, you know, that kind of visibility, you know, kind of being a little bit more visible of what's happening here in Scotland, but also having those conversations, which I'm having more so now than previously, with the UK government to understand what that benefit is.
That kind of answers the next question I was going to ask, which was how good that relationship is between Space Scotland and the UK Space Agency in order to facilitate those discussions. So
Space Scotland itself is only, as an entity in this form, has only been just less than 12 months old. So since me coming into this position less than 12 months ago, that engagement is definitely strengthening. We're seeing more engagement with the UK government, both in terms of the committees, but also in terms of visitation and kind of understanding of what's happening in the sector. The one thing I would say is that it's better if it were more kind of proactive rather than reactive, which is what it is at the moment, but that's just the nature of the beast at the moment. But it's definitely improving. I think it can get better, and you know, the conversations are slightly more informed on both sides now to help move things.
And sorry to stick to Dr. Khan for my next question, but in Space Scotland's submission, it said that Scottish companies lack visibility in the rest of the UK, presumably within the space sector specifically. Can you say more about that and maybe why that is?
So I think it's on that point I've just mentioned. It's that there's a lot happening. The sector in Scotland is moving very, very quickly. So new companies are forming, new technology is being developed, and sometimes that's happening, kind of internal to both companies, but also within the forum as a whole. The UK is obviously a much larger geography, and the visibility, perhaps partly because of engagement, partly because of various different forums that you need to be involved in. There's not necessarily capacity or resource within a Scottish SME to be able to engage all of the different committees and organisations that you would need to be involved in to have that visibility. So one of the things that I'm trying to do is provide that linkage between the SME community and into the likes of UK Space, ADS, and also UK Space Agency. So that kind of front door element, so that not every space company within Scotland has to be part of all of these different forums. I can provide that network. So it's
rather than trying to put yourself up as a replacement for the UK Space Agency, acting as you call it, a front door service to the wider UK machine, for want of a better word. Okay, thank you. And then maybe going to Professor Woodhouse, who would you say would be the global peers and competitors for the Scottish industry? Obviously not the likes of NASA and ESA, but who else around the world are in a similar position to where Scotland is right now?
In terms of having end-to-end capability, I can't think of anybody off the top of my head. It's more in different components.
Let me ask a different way. Is there any countries out there that we need to keep an eye on if we take our eye off the ball?
Certainly for a while, it looked like Luxembourg would want to take a look at. We've also had discussions with companies that we've tried to attract to Scotland who have looked at Portugal as a... these are data companies, just to be clear. Preferential terms for them starting up in Portugal. From the data, so one of the things... and my expertise is more in the data side, so I always have a bias towards the data side. And the thing with the data side is that as long as you've got an internet connection, you can be an island in the Caribbean and you can set up a company doing data analytics.
I'll make it constituency then.
It sounds very tempting. But so you could be anywhere, and so any country that gives you the best terms in terms of setting up to help you get started is potentially attractive for data companies. The challenge, and has been mentioned already in the earlier session, that the growth potential is harder. And I think if Scotland can find a way, or in fact the UK generally, if we can find a way to support that, the growth of those SMEs into sort of medium-sized companies, that would be a key that would unlock certainly a lot of interest, I think, globally, and make us much more competitive.
Do you think there's an opportunity, and a question for both of you really, not just for data, but for Scottish space businesses to be cooperating with other businesses from other equally aspirational countries around the world?
Yeah, and I think that already happens. I think there's a lot of collaboration on the data side, and Dr. Khan will comment, I think, more on the hardware side. But there's a fair amount of international collaboration and recognising that, so companies like Weatherstream, who have their data processing in Edinburgh, is an American company based out of Colorado, and the Colorado side builds the hardware, although they also use Glasgow companies for some of their hardware, I believe, but they do their data processing in Edinburgh, and so that idea of being in different places for doing different components is one of the elements of the space sector, which goes back to your earlier question about the fact that end-to-end isn't necessarily a thing in itself, and you might disagree with that, but I see it more as a key element to that storytelling than it is about the absolute requirement, because you can build the space components and put them together and analyse the data, and you can do that in lots of different countries, and so it's, to go back to your original question, it's quite difficult to see countries that can match. So Sweden or Norway may well be able to, and have a geographic location to launch polar satellites, but they don't have anywhere near the capability in terms of data analytics, for example, or building the actual sensors and platforms.
Dr. Khan, would you disagree with that, or could you expand maybe on the hardware side of things?
No.
Open chance for you.
No, thank you very much. No, I think a lot of what Ian said is absolutely right. It's that, it's the end-to-end capability gives us that talking point to say, and it gives us the hook that then gets international forums and international organisations really kind of sit up and see that, oh, there's a small country in the north of, the UK is actually been developing a lot of this capability. And look, you can do all of these things within the sector from a geographical domain, which is not very large. But to use that in a practical way, space is in its nature a global enterprise. It is, companies are globally located, and if they're worth their essence and salt, then they will be globally located because they have to trade and market at that level. And so whilst we have small satellite and data capabilities in Scotland, yes, if you can launch the satellite from Scotland, then that's an added advantage, assuming the terms and conditions are appropriate. But that doesn't mean to say if it didn't happen that all of a sudden those companies that are building and testing satellites are now not going to be able to go anywhere. They already can do those things. It's a little bit more, arguably you could say a little bit more technically challenging, but it's not an unsolvable problem. And so it doesn't hinder the development of any capability that we have already.
If I may add one other thing about that end-to-end capability is the potential for attracting the talent, both internal in terms of convincing the graduates or even the school kids that actually when we talk about a space sector in Scotland, it is end-to-end, everything, any component bit of the space chain that you're interested in, there'll be a job for you in that sector. That's an important, I would argue, from the university perspective, that's an important thing for our perspective as well, because it really makes us a space nation that does all of the bits and pieces.
And those last remarks you both made reminded me of the previous study we did on the Scotland's international image, if you like, and a lot of the in terms of international trade, would you say there's an opportunity for those interested in the sector or those interested in investing in the sector might come to Scotland to see the small satellites or the launch capacity or the data handling, and actually if we've got more of an end-to-end capability, they'll actually stay and see more of the other parts of the sector that's maybe not quite so globally well established, but could be as a result of being linked with some of those other aspects.
So we are seeing that. So I think from Scottish Development International, the trade body within Scottish Enterprise, they do see space as a real kind of cherry on the cake for them when they go forward internationally to go and talk about what Scotland has to offer, and that really is quite a it's quite a hook for them to use that, and rightly so, because we do have some really kind of world-leading capability for us to be able to do that. And so we have had, Scotland has had some really significant inward investment, FDI coming in to set up base, and a number of different things kind of add value to that, not just the kind of business offerings that obviously Scottish Enterprise can, other development agencies across Scotland can offer, but also, the kind of the hook of the academic base that you have access to, and also the what you want to achieve in terms of developing your business. I think what's interesting is that we're getting to the point now, as we talked about, it is an SME nation of space companies, and so we want to see our own, the companies in Scotland to develop and grow as well. And so we have to be just mindful of how are we get, what companies are coming in, how are they going to be developed, where is the support mechanisms in place for them to grow their business. And it was mentioned in the previous session, though I wouldn't go as far as cannibalisation, but how do we ensure that the resources and the staffing and the skills base is not being diluted to the degree where it becomes harmful for companies who are already there. So there's a number of different things which I think need to be considered. I think all are solvable in a longer or shorter term, but we need to be aware of, as we bring in new investment and new companies to Scotland, which is a great thing to do, what does that look like in terms of the landscape of the ecosystem, and how do we make sure that the skills pipeline behind that is going to be able to furnish it?
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you. Many contributions to the inquiry highlight the challenges the Scottish space companies face in accessing both private and government support, and I think your submission from Space Scotland, Dr. Khan, particularly highlighted the challenges smaller companies face in scaling up in their operations. So what kind of support do they need in order to try and encounter this and get over it?
So I think there's a number of different things that you could say. I mean, if you ask any company, any private company or organisation, they'll say they want contracts. So they want to be able to, be able to sell their products, sell their services within a competitive market. Grants are fantastic and good to a degree for them to do their R&D, for them to develop technology to a particular point. But ultimately, their investors are looking for that bottom line to be met. For their investors to reap the reward as well. And ultimately, companies want to be able to become profitable. That's not going to happen through grants as it is today. And so you get to a point where grants are no longer the kind of the bread and butter that were perhaps at the beginning of a company's journey, and it has to be something slightly different. Now the companies are not necessarily at the scale where they can deliver on the tens of millions of pound contracts that perhaps some of the other large organisations, large companies and primes could be, but they're also not looking for a few 100k here and there, which is usually co-funded at a 50% level, and then has various milestones and kind of ties
the number of our submissions were saying exactly what you said, contracts, not grants, and that will make the significant difference in being able to scale up and operate efficiently. I mean, what sort of companies are we talking about then that would benefit from these type of contract awards?
So I think it's the companies that are at that kind of 50, 100 people, 100 plus people, where they've got themselves, they've developed some technology, they've developed some services, and they've been able to demonstrate the market value for what they're looking to achieve, and they've been able to do that and sell some parts of that business offering that they have. But they want to take the business up to the next level. They want to be able to start to deliver on a much higher either production level capability or from a data.
The contract, what are we describing here? Is this direct government support, or is it for a specific piece of work?
So it could be. I think there's a number of interventions that can happen that governments using services that are home built. So when we look at data services, or we look at Earth observation, and Ian can kind of add into from his experience on this. There are a number of applications that you can think from a government perspective when we look at even just understanding floodplains across the UK, across Scotland. Flooding is a huge issue. So how do we use space data in some of their applications, or monitoring of these things? Do we
not use space data for
not a huge amount, because again it comes through. Okay.
Sorry, go on.
Ian's going to counter it, but it's not done in a baseline level where it's being used as a day-to-day. I think there's added value there, but I think there's still less of an uptake than there could be on some of how this data is used. But I'm going to defer
Professor
to
Woodhouse is bursting to come in.
Yeah.
Well, on the data side, the analogy I use is the typing pool. So I'm old enough to remember my first job at what was then called the Marconi Research Centre, and they had a typing pool where people would handwrite the reports for ESA, in fact, and somebody in the typing pool, and it would be a woman usually, she would type up the report. That's all gone now because we all have Word. We basically pay Microsoft instead of paying typists to do our typing, and we have to do that element ourselves, and the software does all the spell checking and checks your grammar and formats and everything for you. We're at that cusp now, I would argue, in the data side, is that there's lots of government departments that have small numbers of experts, a bit like the typing pool, that do some of that data analysis, and it doesn't work very effectively because there's just a small number of them. They're not usually well resourced, and instead of actually contracting that out to a service supplier who can actually then grow on that and provide those services across different government entities or other governments globally and export those services as well as doing it within the UK, is that they're not getting those contracts because it's all being done in-house in little piecemeal components. And that would be, and I don't know how it applies across the space industry, but certainly on the space data side, I certainly see that, is that we're kind of still using a typing pool model for doing something that actually taking that expertise into the software and then allowing the companies to provide that as services is a much more scalable route. And of course, that scalability is not just about getting those contracts, it's that once you get those contracts, and they're regular, you can open the door to the investor who will give you some growth capital to build on that, because you've got enough money to keep the lights on, and it's a much less riskier.
I think this is coming as a surprise to our colleagues here that this isn't being utilised and used just now. You would expect, particularly with dreadful weather in the course of the past couple of weeks, and like I know my constituency was affected. I suspect that Mr. Ducats was too. I just presumed that this would be space technology would be using to map this out, predict the difficulties we're going to experience, and perhaps offer a way for some sort of mitigation.
So space data is used, and it's primarily used in that context. The Met Office are going to be using it. So the meteorological data is one of the long-lasting examples of where space data is a core part of that industry. I guess it is an industry now. There's lots of more commercial suppliers for weather forecasting and the like. But there are lots of other, and I don't want to pick on individual components of the UK government infrastructure, but there are lots of places where they will be doing some analysis that will use satellite data. But they're less likely to actually contract that out to a service supplier to provide that.
I think I understand exactly the issue here and now, and already I was sort of thinking a number of things we may want to suggest to government about how all this is, because the one thing that the UK's National Space Strategy talks about is improving public services with space technology. What opportunities does this present for Scottish companies if that was to be the ethos of the way of delivering this type of approach?
You asking me?
Yes, go on.
Well, so there was an example recently where, and again, I don't want to go into the details because it's more about the model than the specifics. But instead of putting what was £20 million worth of funding into that was required for doing forests and biomass mapping globally, is that went to a UN organisation in Italy rather than putting out to procurement, or even some of it out as a procurement contract for UK, and that applies to the whole of UK, not just Scotland. But an opportunity for UK companies to bid for some of that work to actually deliver it as a service. And those kind of models have an additional multiplying negative factor, which is that it makes it look like the UK government doesn't trust its own national service suppliers sufficiently to actually put out these contracts to the local companies that it will put out to somewhere else. Now, the specific details of that that contract is not so important. It's just that's a general kind of model where there's not enough joined up thinking to say, and this is something, for example, that the US would do entirely differently, is that they wouldn't dream of contracting out to a UN supplier when they could contract it to US-based companies delivering services that match them.
We need to look quite closely at procurement then, and just awarding the contracts for, the growing space sector, and what you're sort of suggesting, and this would go some way to resolving some of the scaling up issues that we have when it comes to developing the sector.
And also it comes back to the previous point on, just having an awareness of, what does the capability look like either across the UK or in Scotland, in that particular instance, there is capability that could have addressed that need. Now, was there a lack of visibility of that it was there, or was there a lack of just even time to be able to do, to put that information out, or was it just like it's easier, quicker to do it on that side? So I think there's that discussion to be had, is that how do we make sure that when these things are being discussed at a government level, that there is an awareness that there are some capability that you can use in-house within the UK environment, with the UK ecosystem, that can support the delivery of that, and then making use of that before you then look elsewhere.
Really helpful evidence, and thanks for that. And I think this is something that we'll want to explore, particularly when we go to Glasgow next week to meet some of the companies directly and hear from their own experience. But I want to go into the European Space Agency, and I'm conscious that colleagues may want to contribute to this because we had an extended conversation with the UK representatives in the previous panel. But I just want to get to know, first of all, what your experience of all of this is. And some of the figures we've seen here are pretty awful, about Scotland getting only 3% of the UK's ESA return. It hardly seems worth the bother of applying if that seems to be the return. So tell us just a little bit about your experience with this. Why does it not seem to be working, on behalf of Scotland's company? And what do we need to do in order to get a better return from ESA?
I think it was commented in the last session as well, maybe it was during the previous discussion, was that to understand that number, and I don't unfortunately have the background to that figure directly, but we need to understand, well, how many people are applying, what's the success rate of that, and then where does that return land as a result of that. From my own kind of experience within the sector and being part of industry, but also working with industry, is that there's not that many people that go through the fairly arduous process of putting through an application.
Have you heard a little bit about just how arduous that was?
It is. I mean, yeah, you have to know how to do it in order to do it, and I think that's some companies just don't have the time or the capacity to be able to put in these sorts of applications. But also the time it takes from you having an idea to then going to, you have to get, in most of the programmes you have to go through UK Space Agency to get national delegate support. So you first put together a business case or a business plan that goes to the UK Space Agency. They have to accept and appreciate that that's fine, we want to put this forward. And then you go forward and put through the process with the European Space Agency. And that in itself can take, anywhere between 6 to 9 months. So you're looking at kind of just shy of 12 months before when you've had an idea, to even maybe seeing whether or not you're going to get an output, positive or negative. And so most companies haven't got that level, that amount of time to be
trying to keep the lights on.
And they're trying to keep the lights on, exactly. So, so unless you've got kind of the ability to be able to have other things happening in the background, and this becomes a nice to have, it's not really going to be a higher priority. Now, it also is that iteration of you go through a number of times, you understand what they need, and then you get better at it, and then you can kind of start to make that role, that model work. The other element of it is, as is any large bureaucratic operation, there are so many ways into ESA. There are so many different programmes available and different funding routes. And I think one of the other challenges is, does the SME community have a full visibility of that? I'm not sure the answer to that is.
Is there an exercise of probably explaining what ESA do, how the funding works and operates, how to make your applications? Is that something that we need to sort of work on then in order to get the best
part of it is about the funding, the application, but the other part of it is, there's a lot of technical expertise within the European Space Agency, arguably significantly more than what's in the UK Space Agency. And so because of that, you can have discussions at a technical level within the European Space Agency that you wouldn't necessarily have at a UK level. And so understanding the nuances of that is quite important. The other part is, as it was talked about earlier in the session, is that the UK contribute through their funding into ESA on a variety of different programmes. Now, if those programmes don't match what the SME community are wanting to see come out or have kind of technical expertise to engage in, then they're not going to apply for that. So again, it comes back to that facilitation between what the Scottish SMEs are looking to do and where their technical expertise is, and how that matches what the UK is actually putting into the programme. Sometimes that's there's a little bit more challenge.
I don't know if I'm allowed to do this, but I was going to ask you a question.
Oh God.
Which is, because I'm just wondering. I don't know I don't know.
Other unorthodox for select, but go on. I'm interested.
I don't know what the forensics are of that 3% value, but given that the emphasis on the Scottish space sector has a lot to do with the small sats and CubeSats and the new space model, is that's something that ESA has only recently kind of been catching up with, and generally is not putting out procurement contracts for that model. Mm-hmm. And so the nature of the expertise in Scotland doesn't necessarily, it's just following up what you just said there, doesn't necessarily match what ESA is asking for. Yeah. And so it's not necessarily a sign that we're doing something wrong. It's maybe a misalignment as opposed to
Here's a question for you two then, like given we're into asking each other all these is there any way that we could sort of get a sense of like Scotland's relationship with ESA? I mean, I know like we're a subnational state in Scotland, and UK obviously they're going to be the predominant player when it comes to all this, but it would be good to get a sense of like what like the bids are coming from Scotland, because if this 3% figure is not right, and I had it whispered in my ear from our clerks who know this, it probably comes from the Scottish Government, but it would be really good just to get a sound basis of all this. I don't know how we achieve that, but I'm looking at Space Scotland to maybe help us out a little.
We were kind of talking about that earlier in terms of, because that could still be 100% success rate.
Yes, of course, that's exactly it. And I think we just need to better understand this figure, if it's a relevant one and whether it's not. Yes. But I know Mr. Ducat wants to come in.
Well, I was maybe getting too hung up on the actual percentage as well. I was going to ask, I mean, given that the population of Scotland in proportion to the rest of the UK is about 8%, is that 3% actually roughly half of what we think it should be, or should we be more ambitious or more?
It should be more. I mean, considering that, you know, it's like, I don't know, 20% of all space jobs are in Scotland, across the whole of the UK.
15, 20%.
And this is where I think, you know, the fact that the UK Space Agency had never, before we nudged them, talked to the UK's National Robotarium. It's like, but the UK puts in, what, 200 and something million into the ESA programme that includes robotics. It's like, well, that's the opportunity for getting more ESA money. It's not the CubeSat new space kind of.
When we discussed the geo return, which seems to be a reasonably robust concept, obviously that will be applying to the UK and it wouldn't be applying to Scotland, so it would be the UK would expect to get back what it puts in terms of funding ESA, but Scotland isn't necessarily going to be the case because we're not funding it. It's the UK it's coming from.
Traditionally, the UK's not been very good at getting their geo return anyway,
Yes,
and so I would
that,
see great advantage to everybody if we can encourage some of the sectors in Scotland that are not traditionally going into ESA funding to actually convince them or find a way to support on the paperwork and everything else.
I mean, just because this is our first session, obviously we'll get into this a lot more as we go through this. Is ESA really important to the space sector? Do we need to get this absolutely right in terms of a relationship with it?
So I think there is a number of advantages of working alongside ESA, and I've seen it from a variety of different sides of that coin, both from, you know, within an academic environment, but also from an industry environment. ESA provide a very high level of technical expertise. So if you're looking to develop technology and really push it to the edge of what you want to do, then ESA have an array of technical experts across the whole of the member states who can provide input and support into that. And that's a really important part for organisations, for companies that are trying to grow their business and build up that capability. The other element that ESA do is they provide a credibility that if you've worked with ESA and you've successfully delivered on a programme, then actually that gives you the opportunity to go and have conversations with larger companies or investors that you wouldn't be able to open doors with. It was interesting, the point that Professor Woodhouse made earlier about, you know, meteorological data and working with the Met Office. There's been some, you know, kind of opportunities which have happened and some elements of work that have happened where, you know, companies have tried to have those conversations with national agencies on a variety of different data products and data services, and they weren't able to have those conversations, and it was only through a programme of work which was supported through ESA that actually those doors started to open, and then it's become slightly more. So it adds credibility to a very high degree that you can say, and also opening the doors across to the US, because again, the NASA and ESA work very closely together. So if you've had a partnership with ESA and it's successful and it's been really well received, then you have that opportunity to go into
it's a big deal then, isn't it?
Yeah, so I think we should get it right. I think, yeah.
I just have a very basic question of it. Sounds like where ESA is putting its money is not the areas where Scotland has potentially got capability or expertise. And I suppose my question is why is that? Why is the sector in Scotland developed in areas where ESA isn't investing? So why is Scotland developed and not got into robotics?
So it's not ESA's money. So the money's all come from the UK Space Agency, from the UK government. So it's UK government money that goes in. ESA have an array of programmes which they, you know, that they have capability and expertise in, and so the UK then bids into a variety of different programmes. That bidding process comes with a conversation with industry. That industry obviously is across
this
the whole.
Potentially comes back into that earlier question then around Scottish visibility. That if there is an issue around Scottish visibility, then the UK Space Agency isn't then potentially picking up what the sector expertise is in Scotland in order to be able to bid into or fund into the right ESA programmes that would then... And it clearly is an issue from a UK perspective as well, if ESA is not, if the UK is not seeing the return from ESA that other countries are.
I think the challenge is also, that again, coming back to the SME community, so the UK government and UK Space Agency is going to look across the whole gambit of the UK space industry. Now, there are a number of very large primes within the UK in England, and they will have, expertise that they want to drive forward. And to be honest, there isn't, at this point in time, the SME community wouldn't be able to furnish that level of delivery into those programmes. So the UK Space Agency is balancing out what they want to see as part of national level programmes and also the science mission programmes, which I think is also important. We want to make sure that we're part of those much larger science programmes, the Artemis missions and the like, which again SMEs may feed into, but they're not going to be the ones that are leading it. But there is still this little disconnect.
Just feels a little bit chicken and egg.
Yeah,
there's probably a sort of couple of bold decisions that need to be made to kind of crack it.
I know that both Wendy Chamberlain and David Duke have got questions about skills, which is really important because we received a number of submissions on it. But I just want to ask just a little bit about, because we asked the previous panel and I wasn't quite sure the answer about this. The Scottish Space Strategy commits to mapping the infrastructure needs of the sector to identify gaps, and they asked that about the UK. Have any gaps been identified so far? Maybe one for you, Professor Wood.
Good to me. It's the industry pool, isn't
Okay.
it? The universities will respond to that by trying to deliver graduates in the necessary skilled areas.
So, I think if you're talking about facilities or facilities. So, I think that this is
facilities, capabilities and expertise.
Capabilities and expertise. So, it was interesting in the previous panel they talked about an infrastructure fund, the SCIF that they mentioned, which is a slightly prickly topic. But I think it's trying to understand where are there facilities that the SME community can use and as they grow actually have access to it. Now, we do have facilities, things like the Astronomy Technology Centre with the Higgs Innovation Centre at the Royal Observatory in Edinburgh, and they've got a number of lab space and technical and expertise there which companies can go as part of an incubation programme and be able to use those facilities. Individual companies have also got their own facilities which they've grown over the years because they've had a need to do so, but they're by definition going to be quite close to the rest of the community because it's individual companies. The larger organisations which perhaps might open up some of their doors, it becomes you're on their kind of schedule of activity.
Just how do you practically map all this?
How do you practically map it?
Is it just data that you use in order to try and see where the problems are and then try to address it?
So I think one of the things that we can do is on the national facilities, so when we've got the National Manufacturing Institute for Scotland, the NMIS facility, there are obviously facilities there, the National Robotarium, and other facilities like that. Down at the Prestwick Spaceport, there's a number of facilities there. So it's trying to understand what we have already, and then within the university environment, there's a number of technical facilities that we can use. And then looking at that, how is that mapped geographically, and then where is there need that we would actually need to develop infrastructure.
Perfectly now, and you've explained it much more perfectly than our previous panel, so thank you for that. Now, we're going to come to skills, and I know Mr. Ross has just joined us, he might have a couple of questions I want to ask, but like on skills, I think Wendy Chamberlain will introduce the first of these questions. I know David Duke wants to come in on this too. Wendy.
Absolutely, and thank you both for being here today and for being there for the discussion with the previous panel where we did talk about skills quite a bit. Before I do so, can I just ask the sort of similar question as I asked to the previous panel around Horizon and Copernicus and what the impact has been of our not being part of those programmes for the last few years, particularly at a point where the sector has grown quite quickly and in quite a broad way. Have you seen an impact for the Scottish space sector in regards to not being part of those programmes?
So I'll kind of look at it from an industry, but I'd like Ian to talk, if that's okay, on that side. So from an industry perspective, yes, I think there's been a number of programmes that perhaps there's been an uncertainty, obviously, at the time where things were unclear as to whether we were going to be part of it or not. There was then kind of discussion around, well, if the UK is not going to be part of it, there will be the resources that were allocated for that programme would be diverted to a national fund. That kind of happened almost all of a sudden and then disappeared just as quickly in various ways. So the uncertainty was where people were part of discussions or starting to build consortia. They were kind of left a little bit high and dry. Most organisations had to pull out of that, and that was quite damaging they put resources in place and put kind of pathways in place for that to take us forward. I'm not entirely sure where we are today. So I think I'll pass to
absolutely.
Ian on some
And
of
Professor
that.
Woodhouse, if I can add into that, has that had an impact from a skills perspective, that uncertainty? Have people potentially, graduates, made decisions to look elsewhere as a result?
I don't have any evidence or data to back that up.
Okay.
So yeah,
No.
I don't know. I don't know.
Okay. So you, in comparison to the previous panel, you've not felt the impact of Horizon and Copernicus in the way that they were outlining?
At the level of the students and where they go, I can't think of any even anecdotal evidence that would suggest that has a big impact. In terms of staff, it probably has an impact because of the, like Dr. Khan was mentioning, of the sort of not getting the telephone call about being part of a new proposal or a new team trying to put something new together.
And how do you quantify that? Yeah.
And it's difficult to see the not things happening or the things not happening. So it's difficult to see that. And in terms of the companies themselves, from the data angle, if you're not doing the very rapid services, you can always access the Copernicus data anyway, just not on the fast stream. So I'm not aware specifically of any companies.
And I suppose still working its way through now, having come back into the programme, as the previous panel said, it's a different relationship anyway, so comparisons will be more difficult. If I can just move on to skills then, I suppose, what are you seeing are the main workforce challenges? Did you recognise, Dr. Khan, what the first panel were talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are. I mean, nobody will say there's not a skill challenge. There absolutely is skills in terms of the amount of young people.
And I think I remember you earlier saying that cannibalisation wasn't necessarily a term that you would recognise. Can you say a bit more about that?
So I think there's when we bring in new companies or new companies are forming, then naturally they want to build a workforce. Now you're going to build a workforce from those people that you have within the sector. And so at the beginning of a company's journey, you're going to bring in people that are experts or that have some technical expertise. And so, natural attrition across an ecosystem is quite normal. I wouldn't say that that's anything untoward. I think the thing the bit that's challenging is that there's no backfill within the sector to be able to kind of pull through that, the other people that will come in to fill those gaps. And so that's one of the things that we need to look at is that, and one of the things that Space Scotland is looking at is how do we make sure that we are upskilling our workforce prior to these things happening. And the previous panel mentioned that many of the skills are general skills. The space part of it is only a very small element. So one of the things that we're doing is working with the colleges to try and put in these kind of sub-level courses as additional items to their mechanical engineering, electrical engineering courses that they already run, but put in a slight element of space technology. And we've had those courses, micro-credential courses, have been developed with industry to say, well, where are you seeing that you're having to put in additional resource to bring up these young people to that level?
And that is engagement that you're having directly with further education colleges, not with the Scottish Government. So where are the Scottish Government in relation to this?
So we are also having conversations with the Scottish Government as well. This particular piece of work has been funded through the UK Space Agency Levelling Up programme. So it was one of the things that we were able to get resource from a UK level. We are also having conversations with the likes of Skills Development Scotland and Scottish Government directly to say that there's a much bigger pipeline of skills that we need to develop as we start to grow. The sector is growing. And so we need to be able to understand what does the skill profile look like, not just today, but in 5 years' time, so that we plan for that, so that in 5 years' time we're not in a worse case than we are today.
And it sounds to me, just based on the earlier conversation, that even just having that visibility of the sector within a course might then make somebody think about it. Professor Woodhouse, did you nod there? Do you agree that we need to kind of just broaden that understanding when we're talking about STEM around space being part of that?
Yeah, definitely. And that's so the Scottish Space Academic Forum is just starting an audit to try to look at what students we are, or the topics that people are graduating in, where the numbers are, and so that we can match up in terms of what the industry is saying that they're not getting. But there's also, and I think it's a UK issue for the space sector, is that people in marketing and management and all these other skills, sales, who don't know anything about space, and also people that finding experienced people. So there's a lot of entrepreneurs in the space sector in Scotland, but not any that have gone through multiple cycles to be experienced entrepreneurs. And so we're still quite at an early stage, and that's not something a university sector can really tackle. But we are...
it can potentially provide the seedbed to help, but you're absolutely right, I suppose, in terms of the ongoing maturity.
Yeah. And then the STEM thing, I think it was mentioned in the previous session about getting more women into STEM. I don't think getting them into STEM is the problem. I think there's an attrition of... Because my undergraduate classes in remote sensing and Earth observation for 20 years have been more than 50% female in the class, but that's not reflected 20 years later in the industry. So there's other things, and I know Space Scotland and the what's the group called? The Voices.
New Voices.
New Voices group is very active in trying to tackle that in the Scottish sector, because there's potentially a huge mass of talent that is doing something else because for some reason they don't feel the space sector is where they belong. And that messaging
like the
has
initial
to be,
interest.
Yes, that message, we have to find out where those key points of loss are and tackle them. Because I don't think it's at
there's
the
no
very
point
early
keeping
stage.
feeding stuff into people into the pipeline if they're coming out at other stages.
And so one of the pieces of work that we did quite early on in Space Scotland was develop a kind of equality, diversity and inclusion guidance pack for industry to really look at and understand, what does it mean to be an equal, diverse and inclusive employer, and how do you ensure that your workforce does have that element fundamental within your company organisation. And it came out of that a work that was done through a volunteer group called New Voices, which essentially was individuals who came together to try and articulate what does it mean to be in a sector which is predominantly very middle class and that element.
If you want people to be thinking more widely.
Widely, exactly. So there's quite a lot of work. So we've developed that pack, but also we try and now it's not just a piece of work that gets done and it gets shelved. We actually take it and we work with companies to actually try and talk them through. Well, how can you start to put interventions in place that will help you manoeuvre? And it can be the simplest things, from the way that your website is worded to the way that you're kind of putting promotional material together and that language that you use, so that it becomes more inclusive and so that people look at it and go, that speaks to me, it's not speaking to somebody else. So thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Something that's come up in a number of inquiries we've done, whether it's about energy or defence and now space, is a reserved policy area to the Westminster Government, but what we've just been talking about, skills, education, schools, colleges, universities, apprenticeships, are devolved. What would you say, either of you, about the opportunities that we should be taking to try and have the UK Government and the devolved administrations working closer together to try and bring those reserved, more strategic issues together with those devolved functions?
So it's a very good point, and it's something I've thought a lot about as well. I think when we talk about STEM and we talk about education, one of the things, obviously, I've grown up in Scotland, my whole education system was in Scotland, but then I moved to England. I did my kind of postgraduate work down in England, and what was clear to me was, we have a distinct education system within Scotland, and it has its metrics and its various different levels, and I would say that in England, there's almost no visibility or even understanding of how that translates. Even today, I have conversations with my colleagues south of the border, trying to let them understand, well, a Nat 5 is equivalent to a GCSE and a higher, and I'm still having that conversation. So having an alignment or a better understanding of if there's STEM engagement or there's interventions happening in a UK level, but it's very much focused to the English-Welsh framework of education, how make sure that translates up into Scotland so it can be equally delivered. And sometimes that's not as clear as it should be or as it could be. Because I think there is a lot of work that's been done down at both the National Space Academy in Leicester. There's other kind of STEM learning programs which are very much based down in London. And how do we use that material that we can then translate it into the education forum in Scotland? Now there is work that's done directly within Scottish Government to take those tools and try and kind of translate them over. But it's an additional task that needs to be done in order to do it. Or individual teachers have to do it themselves, which is a burden on them, which you don't want to add to their workload. So there's that element first of all, so that then there's a synergy across what we're looking to achieve, because ultimately everybody goes out into the workforce and has to then be able to articulate that in the same way. How we use that and how that can be used from a government perspective, I don't know the answer to that, but I think a better alignment would be really valuable in those cases.
Professor Woodhouse, would you have anything to add?
I wouldn't add very much more to that. There's quite a lot of activity, I think, UK-wide for support and and outreach and stuff. And despite some of the the challenges in that, I think there's a goodwill generally to and an enthusiasm of the subject that I don't see any particular hurdles.
It's within the industry.
And more from an academic perspective. I mean, and it was probably well articulated in terms of a lot of the activities that happened during the COP in Glasgow, for example. There was a lot of space-related climate activities that were there, and that brought in Scottish-based companies and things to get involved with what the UK Space Agency was doing there.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. I mean, it's surprising to me that there isn't a whole host of young people just desperate to get into the space sector and finding and charting some sort of career. I understand, obviously, like the recruitment issues about getting the right type of student from universities, but I mean, there must be something we could do to encourage more young people to think about it.
I think the storytelling has to be much better, right? So I was at the down at Greenwich in the Maritime Museum, and there was a little corner in the shop, and all I could see was NASA logos.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, that's part of the problem, is because if somebody grows up in the UK getting excited about space, they've got NASA in lights ahead of them, and they follow that.
Yeah.
I think we're going to have to think about this, because I mean, like the first Scottish space mission, or the legacy of Scotty the engineer on Star. I mean, there must be things that we could do to.
So I think it's championing that which is real and which is happening. Obviously we've had we're hopefully going to be having launch out of Scotland soon, but irrespective of that, there are launch companies that are developing rockets and technology in Scotland, also across the UK, and so we have to make sure that that's visible to everybody who wants to have that conversation. But launch and rockets is only one part of it. That's going to only going to be kind of relevant to a very small percentage.
If we do get our first launch facility, which I'm certain we're going to get in the next few years, will that not generate excitement about what we're doing?
Well, I think it'll generate excitement within a subset of people who are already excited about space. But I think the bigger problem is that we want to ensure that everybody is excited about space, because it's so much more than just a big rocket going off from an island off the top of Scotland. It's so much more than that. And you know what, you mentioned, kids going through hires and Nat 5s. I've got young people as well at home. And despite me, pretty much talking about space all the time, they cannot be bothered listening to me. Exactly. But it's interesting, I hear from them and I talk to them, I said, well, what is it important to you? And it doesn't seem, it's not that it's not relevant, they just don't see the value of it. They don't see how it relates to what they find that they're worried about. And so it's trying to bring a conversation for our young people that actually addresses some of the things that they are concerned about. And as much as I love the sector and space, and I've done this all my life, it's not necessarily the same conversation that we need to have with young people today. So it's having that discussion.
Really interesting. Douglas Ross.
Thank you, Chair, and apologies to this panel and our previous panel. I was in the chamber asking a question on the Israel-Gaza statement by the Prime Minister. And if anything I've asked has already been asked, please just say, and I'll look at the Hansard report on that. But sticking with skills, and David Duke alluded to it, we've spoken about skills a lot in a number of our inquiries on renewables, on defence, now in space. And yes, this issue about Scottish and UK governments comes up a lot, but also this huge gap in potential people. So you are all, looking for the same people to fill significant roles, be it in shipbuilding, be it in construction for renewables on and offshore, and in space. What's going to be your USP? What's going to attract someone with the skills that they already have, but they're, in shipbuilding, or they're in renewables, or they're in another sector, to come across to space?
So one of the biggest attractions is that it is the space sector, and a lot of people get very excited about.
Warship's quite exciting, though, and
are they?
Yeah. Are they? It's a question we ask All of them, and
Yeah.
I think it's a difficult one because there are a number of people across Scotland who have the skills you're looking for just now, but there are not enough of them, and the competition is so high, and I just wonder how you deal with that competition.
I think part of it comes back to, again, I've just mentioned, is that, what is it that the young person is wanting to achieve in their life? If they're looking to space could add value and make a difference in everyday life. If we're looking to, when we talk about, the planet and the detrimental effects of what's happening, and how do we make sure that the planet is in a form that we can live and work with, kind of use in the future, then space has a role to play in that. You can be doing something which is impacting the world that we will live in 10 or 20 years' time in a positive way. So you're providing, building satellites or data collection or analysing things when we're looking at things like flooding or wildfire detection, or even the way our fisheries are being monitored to make sure that sustainable farming is being used in a way which is useful. So you can start to have a conversation that there's real value in when you look at space and you look at understanding how that data is used. So that kind of gets people quite excited about, well, actually I could, like you said, go and work in the defence sector. Arguably that's one way to go. Or I can actually make a difference in the world that we live in the future by using my skills in a different way. So that's one of those elements. The other element is that, there's a slightly different perspective that you have. So whilst you might be doing something in the financial sector and you're doing data analytics, or you're looking at how insurance claims can be used using, you could be using space data in that forum. So you're not working in the space sector, you're working in the financial services sector, but you're using space data to verify insurance claims because of subsidence on someone's land and their house has gone down. And so was that land previously suspected of subsidence, or had it happened lately and something's happened? So you can use space data in that. Now, you can say that the skills that you need are kind of space-based resources, but you're not in a space sector environment per se. So it comes back to what we talked about earlier, is that we want to start getting young people to think about and the skills that we need across the whole domains of the industry, not just, you've got to work in the space industry. You can be using space data in a variety of different forums, but that's still part of the expertise that you're looking to achieve.
And understandably, and I agree, a lot of the focus is on young people and their education and bringing them on. What about people currently in these industries who have the skills that you need right now? What attracts them away from defence, from renewables, to go into space?
What attracts them away?
In the data, so I'm more in the data side of things. What we see, and in the companies that I've been involved with, is that a lot of the data companies can be purpose-driven companies that are, like you were saying, are contributing to solutions rather than contributing to the problems. And that, I think for many people, that's seen as a positive thing. They feel like there's a reason to get up in the morning, not just to do the work, but the work is actually being productively used to tackle various things. I'm trying to say it in a way that's very generic, but I think that's one of the things, and we probably I think a lot of companies will work quite hard to communicate that to their employees to make sure that that's something that they would choose them for.
And sorry, back to Dr. Khan, you mentioned in response to the chair about how the launch could be of great interest to people who are already interested. Is there also a risk that people could look at that? Because that's a big focal point, but from what I've seen, a lot of these launches don't go particularly well to begin with. Is there a risk sometimes if we say to young people, look what's going to happen at Saxavord, etc., when there is that first launch and it doesn't go well? Is there an expectation management issue within the industry to say, look, actually we get better because of the failures, it's not just a write-off? I just worry sometimes we put too many eggs in that basket. We saw it in Cornwall, etc.
Yeah, no,
I wonder what the response is.
Yeah, I totally agree with you on that. I think we need to make sure that this is a long-term game here. It's not first launch and everything's great and we all go home and everybody gets great. It is a long-term. It is these things are people say it's difficult. It's not so much difficult, it's just a case of making sure that you've got the technical expertise up to a very high level in order to succeed. And so, you're right. If you look at statistically in terms of the global launch market, statistically you'll see that so many first launches of a variety of different companies will not necessarily be as successful as they had hoped, but they'll still be successful in a way that they can develop technology moving forward. And that's what it needs to be talked about as a stepping stone to where we want to get to. The first launch, if they're able to launch off the launch pad and it goes so far up and something doesn't go according to plan, that doesn't make it a failure. It means that they were able to do this much and be able to get the regulations in place, all the legislation, everything that needed to happen to meet that launch window and all the rest of it, and then they just do an iteration on the rest of that technology. So we do have to manage expectations, and we all hope for the best, and so we should, but we have to realise that actually there's a lot of things that need to align in order to make that launch 100% successful, I would say, but that doesn't mean to say any less than that is unsuccessful, and so we do need to make sure. But I think it's also just still there are a lot of people out there, and I mean this in terms of both the industry as well as the public domain, that still feel that it's a pipe dream a little bit. And I think we need to change. We need to start bringing that more into a norm, and it is happening. The work that Sixth Award and Sutherland are doing to bring it into that normal day-to-day working within the media as well as within things like this, so that people become more familiar with actually this is going to be part of our industry and as a career. And it was interesting, the last panel mentioned that actually when we talk about young people and trying to get them excited about space, they're not the ones that need to be excited about. It's the parents and the guardians and the carers perhaps that don't have as much visibility or knowledge that kind of says, well, really, are you going to do that? And I think that's still true today.
And just on that point, and finally, I think it's really important because you wouldn't think a constituency like Murray would have much links to the space sector, but with Orbex, at Forest here, it's brought that to an area of Scotland that probably traditionally wouldn't have expected to be involved in, and a lot of interest. Professor Woodhouse, I was really interested when you said that your classes have for many years been 50-50 male-female, but the attrition rate with the female candidates going through is so high. Why is that? And has it been going on for so long? Has it been looked at? What can be done? Where are they going with these skills, and why are they not staying within the sector?
I've no idea is the short answer to that, and I think that's something that we're working with some of my colleagues and with the New Voices group in Space Scotland, is that because to be perfectly frank, it was a fairly recent realisation, because I used to think that that diversity will just sort of make its way through the career stages. And then I realised I was making that argument to myself, and I thought, but I've been doing this for 20 years. All of those students from 20 years ago should be reflecting. And if that's and assuming it's not just my classes, but it's representative across the board, and this is on the data side rather than the hardware side, is that it's still why we're not seeing that reflected. But there are other, the statistics on how poorly funded female-led startups are, for example, from venture capitalists and other funding, is, that there are so many different components in there, which is working against trying to stop that attrition, is that I don't think there's a single answer to that. But we're trying to tackle some of that. And at Edinburgh, one of the things we're trying to do with our master's students in particular is actually also focusing on the male students and recognising that they have to learn the things that they have to do and to change their habits and behaviours in the industry in order to change. It's not, there's too much an emphasis where it's the female participants are told, well, you've got to write better CVs and you've got to blow your own trumpet better and you've got to do all these other things, when in actual fact, well, the white male middle-aged managers need to be better at identifying talent when it's there. And so there's so many components, but I think Scotland is actually doing a better job than many other places at actually at least addressing it. We haven't solved it yet, I don't
No.
think.
No.
But it's at least a high priority, and it's a key component of the Scottish Space Strategy, and it's a key component of what you're doing in Space Scotland.
Thank you both very much, and thank you, Chair.
Yes, thank you both very much for this. It's been a fascinating, and instructive and useful opening session, and I think we all better understand some of the issues and some of the things. I mean, again, like I said, the first panel, if there's anything else that you feel that you could usefully contribute to this inquiry as we just get underway, please get back in touch with us. But thank you for coming down from Scotland today. It's been a really interesting session. And so far, just now, order.